totally knew what I was doing though, I promise. Forced assimilation, displacement, violence, death. That's what the Native Americans faced during their colonization. Hi, I'm Al-Saadi, and I'm a secondary ed and history major here at Rider University. Today, I'm going to talk to you about ways to teach America's first genocide against the Native American population. By 1665, only a couple hundred years after Columbus made contact, 95% of the Native American population was gone. That's a quote from Professor Higgins. The majority of them would have never seen white or black skin. This is something steel could never do. This was disease. For anyone thinking, well, genocide needs to be intentional, disease isn't intentional, they didn't know this would happen, I would like to tell you about the events that happened after. So first off, yes, 95% were killed by disease. Then in 1830, those who are still alive, for those who were around, Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, leading to the horrifying Trail of Tears, which killed thousands of men, women, children. They died from exhaustion, exposure. It was horrible. Their forced journey to an unfamiliar and inhospitable land was one that was nearly impossible. Very few made it. Then, if you're still around and you still survived, you were forcefully assimilated, as carried out through missionary programs and boarding schools. These were aimed to whitewash and erase their language, their culture, their tradition, and their identity completely. The cultural genocide, in combination with physical violence and forced displacement, tore apart the fabric of Native American communities. By the end of the 19th century, the population was but a fraction. Their way of life was nearly obliterated. This was not a series of isolated events, but a comprehensive campaign of destruction that left scars for generations, making it so important to learn about. But how do we teach such a complicated thing? With 95% of the population gone, oftentimes the primary sources we look at will be from the side of the oppressor. I found 8 really good sources I thought that demonstrated the horrors. The majority of them were not from Native Americans though. The first one I find very significant I would like to talk to you guys about is Lepage de Prat's manuscripts. This is a man who was European and was sick and was treated by Native Americans. He compares his treatment to his other European colleagues who did not have as good treatment. I think this source is really good for students as it shows them a achievement of Native American culture, and it teaches them to ask what ifs. What if Native Americans were still around? How would the medical system be different? If their treatment is so much better, how could things be different today? It's important we talk about the accomplishments because though they are victims, we can't just look at that. It's not fair. We have to look at both. For a primary source I had by Native American, I included several by Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph, his real name was Him-Ma-Tu-Ya-Lat. He gave multiple speeches about wanting to be a free man, talking about being tired of fighting, and emphasizing the pain and suffering. Chief Joseph's language is such that students can compare to some things they'll hear during like the civil rights movement and abolitionists with the vocabulary, which I think makes this a really good source for synthesizing other units later on. And then lastly, I think the most important one I had was Memoirs of the West, the Spaldings by Elizabeth Spalding Warren. Elizabeth was a daughter in a missionary house, so she saw it from the perspective of the oppressors. She, in her book, she expressed sorrow and regret for what they had done to the Nez Perce tribe and other Native Americans. They had the intent to save them, but in reality, that wasn't what was happening. So it gives students a great view on how these things can happen, even though they're so bad. Secondary sources are really important too. They fill some content knowledge gaps that's very needed for the kids. Additionally, if you pick a more modern one, the language is simpler and easier for them to understand when sometimes primary sources, the language freaks them out. One of my favorites was We Survived the End of the World by Steve Charlson. In this book, the elder looks at the chaos of the events of like displacement and stuff. Some people initially thought it was a primary source, but it's not. He's referring to ancestral knowledge, but this is not his experiences at all. It's It makes it such a good source though, because the ancestral knowledge plus his research makes him such a great source. Another one is Bury My Heart at the Wounded Knee by D. Brown. If you've heard of Wounded Knee, that's a massacre, a very famous massacre that was very tragic for the Native Americans. D. Brown writes about the systematic displacement, the betrayal, and the violence that pushed them off ancestral land. And lastly, there were so many I loved, but I really wanted to mention Native American Women by Renee Green. This is an anthropological study identifying the recurring thing she calls the Pocahontas perplex, which is how historians often depict Native American women from the colonists' interests and undermine the complexity of them and the agency of Native American women. So here are some big picture questions we can ask students. How did Native Americans communities resist policies of removal, and what were the consequences of this resistance? What role did race and cultural superiority play in the justification of the forced removal and genocide of Native Americans? How can understanding America's first genocide shape our perspectives on modern issues of social justice and indigenous rights? I find that one particularly interesting, but I think all these would be great in a classroom. Their untold stories need to be told in our classrooms. So many great ways to do this. You could have a DBQ, discussion-based question, like where you have a lot of sources and you make them answer some big question. You could facilitate a debate. You could hold a book club or do a guided research project. All these pair great with some of my essential questions and sources I mentioned. For my sample lesson plan though, I wanted to phone in on a debate. This hypothetical lesson plan was crafted for 10th and 11th graders and was expected to take an hour and 30 minutes, but obviously every classroom's different, so I was just guessing. I've never taught this. The debate question I settled on, I had so many ideas, but I really liked, was the colonization in Native American communities an act of cultural destruction or a necessary and justifiable form of American expansion? For their objectives, I was hoping students will be able to develop arguments using historical evidence, articulate points clearly, and understand multiple perspectives on the topic. Students will be able to engage in debate to critically examine the causes and effects of Native American genocide during European colonization. So for class, here's how I kind of saw it going. I was thinking that it would be the first 35 minutes for students to read and analyze their sources independently, then give them 20 minutes to get in their groups, assign them which side, assign their groups, whatever works for your classroom, 20 minutes to prepare their argument, and then 30 minutes of actual debate according to whatever format your district uses for debates, because I know everyone does it differently, whether it be a fishbowl or back and forth. And then 5 minutes of class reflection, closure up to the instructor, what works good for you, if it's an exit ticket, if it's a couple slides, if it's a reflection ball game or something, whatever you think will work for you. The two sides I would assign would be side one. While European colonization clearly contributed to the suffering, it alone cannot be blamed, with side two saying that European colonization is the primary driver, and without it, the culture would be alive and thriving. Side one would hopefully focus on, from the sources, the outside factors, the pro-expansion argument, and the justification of intent, where side two will pull from the sources the Trail of Tears, occupation, and destruction of culture. I think with the sources I provided, there's arguments for both, though the students will probably lean towards side two. That's why you assign it, force them to get out of their comfort zone. And then I won't bore you with the details of what each of these standards are, but I put down 2 history, 2 civics, and a geography. I feel like this topic can cover a lot, whatever you want it to. Thanks for listening.
I have a question. President Trump last week talked about revitalizing the celebration of Columbus Day in this country.
He did.
In recent years, some states moved away to a day celebrating indigenous peoples because of some of the relationships to Columbus and what you just described. What do you think?
Well, I have always been a big supporter of how people protesting Columbus Day would call it Indigenous People Day and would not partake. And people have off and stuff, but you can still talk about the horrors he did on that day. Additionally, from what I see inside people's elementary schools, I don't think people talk about it the way they did when I was in elementary school today. I look at what my sisters are learning in
You
school.
can imagine what I learned. He wasn't even born when I was in school.
But I think that would be a step in the wrong direction, but I think regardless of if that's an official thing or not, people are still going to talk about the Indigenous community, even if it's not what it's called.
Thank you, nice job.
Thank you.
Next up, I believe it's